Late last year, on a night where the air was as cold as it was clear, a black leather-bound notepad fell through a hole that existed only for the tiniest moment. The rip in time produced an explosion that smashed windows and set off car alarms. An entire street woke up at 3 a.m. to the disturbance. The police arrived in minutes and were given nothing other than the worn leather book found by a small boy in his pajamas. It took months, and the book was thumbed by many hands until eventually its genius was discovered, tested, and proven. The book now resides in the London Science Museum and is deemed one of the most valuable scientific texts ever to have been discovered. This is what it reads. I think I am the last human alive. This place I'm in is, in many ways, a paradise. Although the sign into town still stands, there's not a lot else that does. I came here because I remember how Sacandaga Lake looks so beautiful in the sunset. I found a small rowing boat a couple of years ago that had held together over tens of years in its storage shed, so I spend most of my days fishing out on the water. This place has none of the horrors I have come across, but also none of the people I love. No people at all, in fact. It's just me, this book, and my machine, and I'm ready now. Let me tell you how I got here. My name is Julian Brown. I live at 71 O'Neill Street, Kingston, New York, and as far as I know, I am the world's first and only time traveler. I suppose I have a new title now as well. I'm the last human to ever live on planet Earth. I would try and put this nearer to my home back south, but it's too far for me now. I just hope it lands in good hands. In the year 2026, I will finalize the working version of my time machine. The time hopping had become a reality when I realized that it is only possible to travel forwards in time. Attempting to travel backwards would immediately change history, and then the future that develops is different to the one in which the traveler leaves, thereby making it impossible for them to ever have left in the first place. As it turns out, the butterfly effect has profound complications when it comes to time travel. My first time jump took me forward 1 week. As you'd expect, life was the exact same as it was when I left, except that my work had let me go. I didn't mind much. The discovery I had made was incomprehensibly valuable. So a week went by in the blink of an eye. I took a walk around the neighborhood, making sure everything was in working order, both for me and the world itself. Once I was happy that there were no complications, I took the machine to the little garden at the back of my house. Another blink of the eye and 6 months had passed. I remember the grass from the garden lapping at my ankles. It was long and unkempt from half a year of not being cut. I went into the house, and my unclean plates on the side had grown considerable mold. I took my phone out of my pocket and found hundreds of emails, missed calls, and texts displayed on the screen. I called my poor 70-year-old mum, and she cried. I went straight over and explained where I'd been. I couldn't believe I hadn't bothered to think about her. She tried to talk me out of my plans, but by this point it was too late. I had to go further. I had to see what was next for us all. She promised me she would hide my work and sell my home. Looking back, I wish I had listened. I wrote a will, said goodbye to my family, and what few friends I had. It was profound. I felt as though I was purging myself of the world I had lived in for my entire life. In 6 months, my mother could claim on my life insurance policy. Next, I jumped 30 years. My phone no longer worked. I went to the bank, and 23 years ago, a couple $100,000 had entered my account. My mother's will, it turned out. The interest had accrued to over $500,000, and so I withdrew as much as I could and brought all of the latest tech. The newest things were holographic lenses that project everything over your vision, from news stories and weather to people's moods and social network profiles. They had all manner of uses. The war in Syria had ended. The government had taken control and militants were extremely rare. Russia had seized total control of Ukraine. Things were easy then. Cars were quiet, electric, and drove themselves. Drones delivered. People worked fewer hours and seemed, for the most part, happy. I spent 2 months in the utopia of the 2050. When you get there, make the most of it. I just hope I haven't changed it too much by writing this. Eventually, I removed my lenses and discarded my phone, then jumped another 30 years. People I had left as babies on my first time jump were now older than me. The town was deathly quiet. I wandered through a street paved with ransacked shops, burned vehicles, and broken windows. I shouted for someone, for anyone, but no one came. After a while, a beaten-up electric van drove up the street. The silver paint was scratched and the walls were dented, but it was still moving. A red light on the top of the bus pinged to green and it came to a halt by an old bus stop. Without really thinking, I ran to the van and hopped in. With no driver, the whole of the inside of the shuttle was made for passengers, so I sat at the front. The door shuffled shut awkwardly, and then the van began its journey out of the town, stopping at a few more empty bus stops along the way. A voice on the bus was repeating itself.
Emergency shelter bus. Please keep hold of all of your belongings and make way for other passengers.
I eventually arrived alone, at a massive metal wall built into the side of a hill I now know was near Woodstock. The van put itself on charge as I walked up a door built into the bottom corner of the wall and pressed my finger against a button beneath a screen. I called a hello into the speaker and waited for a while until I got a response. I later found out that they had stopped monitoring the outside of the shelter years before I arrived, so it took some scrambling to get someone to the microphone on the inside. I exchanged words with the voice coming from the shelter, and after repeating myself a few times, they hesitantly let me in. Russia had made a move beyond Ukraine and beyond subtle threats. Their bombs had not come from the air, but from the sea, and they had not really been bombs at all. Anyone near the coast had no chance of avoiding the attack. They, along with a large percentage of the world, had come to be known as hounds. The hounds were people that had been infected by a chemical attack that had simply been able to change the chemistry in their brains. They had been left in a constant fight or flight mode, and had lost the ability to converse or think logically. This had resulted in rioting and stealing and eventually, a total breakdown in the economy. The chemical attack was passed by infection, and before long these massive shelters had been constructed all across the world. In even less time, they were populated. I stayed at the shelter for a few days. People saw hope in me, but there was really nothing I could do. By 2086, we were no longer advancing. Survival was the prime target now. I went out on a couple of excursions for vital supplies with a small group. The virus was only passed through bodily fluids, so as long as we stayed away from the hounds, we should have been fine. As we were exploring around a nearby town, we heard screams from the half-humans. We jumped into a nearby diner and took up defense behind the food counter. We were silent, but they found us anyway. From all around us, the hounds appeared from street corners and roofs. I heard heavy footsteps above my head. Men, women, and children came for us. Their eyes locked on us all as the bodies outside began to shrink in on our defense like the closing of a drawstring bag. They carried weapons. It was mostly just scavenged weaponry, metal poles and bats and hammers. As the first hound got to the glass-fronted door of the diner, one of us fired. It hit the small boy in the center of his forehead, and he fell to the floor in an instant. The others trampled over him, taking bullets and falling themselves. The others told me to go, and they didn't mean to go back to the shelter. I wasn't armed, and in their own words, I was a hindrance in the current situation. I went into the back room, pulled the little machine out of my pocket, and set it for a week. When I reopened the door, the floor was slick with blood. Flies swarmed around the bodies by the doors, and also on the bodies of my search party members. A lot of their innards had been pulled out and feasted on. It had now dried and was stuck to the floor. I snuck around my newly made friends' corpses and outside into the fresh air. I didn't want to go back to the shelter. I walked up to a small forest above the town and skipped 50 years. In 2136, the town was the same as 50 years before. The buildings were beginning to be overtaken by the world around it. Tall grass was growing in the streets, and ivy clung to any surface it could climb. There were no paths forged out of the foliage. I didn't explore. Another 50 years, another growth spurt from the flora. A building had fallen down, probably weakened from the plants splitting any cracks wider with their roots. Animals were in abundance. I could barely hear myself think over the bird calls. Deer grazed on the grass beneath the traffic lights. I hopped one final 50 years, and this is where I am now. I've lived a fantastic life over the last 5 years in these times. I built myself a home within one of the once decrepit buildings in the town. It has a great view of the lake at sunset. I hunted deer, rabbit, and boar. I found books to occupy myself with over the years, but I am done now. I want to travel further, to see what is next, but I cannot. I cannot risk not being able to send this book back to you all, and the second I do, this will all cease to exist. In the next few pages are a few things, the proof of who I am, and all of my schematics for time travel. I beg you to use this information wisely. For now, so long. Julian Brown, May 4th, 2236.